All right, so this is a continuation of the last video, and this comparison here is an extension of where I ended. I think it's interesting if you look at urban America, the idea of greater interdependency. What I really want to focus on here is why is it that where you have lots of people living together, in other words, in urban areas, the more densely packed people are, if you look at the final question on this slide, there is a direct correlation between population density and Democratic voting, meaning voting for the Democratic Party. And there is the inverse is also true, that where there are the fewest number of people per square mile, in other words, when there's low population density, there's very high rates of Republican voting. So in other words, rural America votes Republican and urban America votes Democrat. Well, why? Well, part of this is, if you look at rural America, what rural America stands for. We talked in the last video about those traditional values, right? The traditional values being traditional Christian values, traditional gender roles, anti-abortion, those sort of conservative values. This idea of individualism. So people who live in rural areas want to be left alone. There's some overlap between rural America, by the way, and Southern and Appalachian cultural values. So that idea of just leave me alone and suspicion of central government. And the idea of, since land is the source of wealth and land is to be exploited, the government shouldn't put environmental restrictions on anything from how you get oil out of the ground, right? So fracking policies, which is that kind of horizontal drilling techniques that again, rural America is generally in favor of, then they want to be left alone. So they don't want the government telling them what to do. Now, in urban areas, obviously, there is going to be is going to answer that final question, which is that if you live with a lot of people around you, you need public transportation and you need infrastructure. You need to have, you see where your tax money is going, providing the structures that you need to hold things together. And so that interdependency, part of interdependency means you need a bigger government to take care of all of those things, whether it's schools or whether it's public transportation and things like that. So generally speaking, those who live in urban areas want a more activist and generally more responsive government. So again, support for entitlements means helping poor people out. Generally, people who live in urban areas want that. They see that if they make money, they're willing to be taxed a little bit higher for the sake of taking care of people. Whereas in rural America, the idea is, look, if we're all individuals and we're all self-sufficient, if someone's poor, at least they can survive on what they have. And if they can't, then that will happen through the church, right? The church will raise money. The church will take care of these people. And since all of these people are in church communities, we don't need the government. We'll just do it through the church. So urban America does have higher rates of education, and it is less religious, less traditionally religious for sure, but less religious overall. So there's going to be a big difference between the culture of rural America, which is the church culture, and the more secular culture of the urban area. And of course, we see this in Concord and Carlisle and Boston. There's just not as much of a religious focus, except in the working class. So the working classes, and particularly immigrant working classes, tend to be a lot more religious, and they tend to be a little bit more conservative. And that's why the working class America tends to vote Republican too. So I hope that kind of explains things. Now, the last thing I want to touch on here is the Wizard of Oz. Now, this might be a weird way to end, but the populists were, as you remember, they were the rural conservatives, and they were the people that were criticizing the government that they felt was just representing corporate interests and didn't have any role to play in helping them out. So Coxey's army was a group of populists who began in Kansas and marched on Washington. It was literally a march on Washington to protest the policies of the time. And in the middle of that, Frank Baum, who was the writer of The Wizard of Oz, wrote this story called The Wizard of Oz, which most of you have seen if you've seen the movie. And it's interesting because this movie is all about, the story is all about the metaphor of that time. So if you think about the story, there's Dorothy, wholesome girl from Kansas, and it's no coincidence she's from Kansas, which was the center of the populist movement. It's where Coxey's Army started out. And so there she is, in her house, which gets sucked up in a tornado, as she does. And the tornado is sort of like the metaphor for all of the forces of industrialization and social and cultural change in the late 19th century that the farmers were felt so overwhelmed by. So she gets sucked up into this other reality. And if you remember where she starts off in Munchkin Land with a bunch of small people who are feeling oppressed by, the witches and the forces of around them. And so that, like the farmers, they have been reduced in size, literally. They work in guilds, which is interesting because a guild, right? We represent the Lollipop Guild, if you remember that first song and the Munchkins sing, is all about, working communally, getting back to the old communal ways of doing things, and that's very much what the Munchkins symbolize: fighting against the witch, who is the force of, particularly the Wicked Witch of the West, who is the force of kind of agricultural mayhem. Bringing all the monkeys with her, sort of, forces of drought, all of the things that were threatening the farmers are embodied in those witches. Now, you think about it, she goes along the yellow brick road and she meets a scarecrow, right? A terrified and not very smart guy who only wants a brain, and he represents the farmers, right? Who need brains, who need to be educated. That's Brahms' idea. And then he meets the Tin Man, right, who is an industrial worker, right, and who needs a heart. And this idea that the people who live in the urban areas need to be a little bit more sympathetic to the people that live in the rural areas. And then you have the Cowardly Lion who comes along, and the Cowardly Lion was a metaphor for William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic candidate. And obviously, as the Cowardly Lion suggests, William Jennings Bryan was too afraid to go against the corporate interests that were also part of his party. And so this is a populist critique of the Democratic Party, and it's the reason why they don't originally align with the Democratic Party, although they do at the end. So, as he finds his courage. So the story is they're going along the yellow brick road, and the yellow brick road is a road of gold bricks, right? And that's kind of obvious. In the original story, she's wearing silver slippers, not ruby ones, as you see in the movie. And so the silver slippers represent, right, the idea of the importance of a wider money supply. The gold brick road leads them to Oz, which is the sort of the center of the industrial powers of that world. So when she gets to the Wizard of Oz, right, there's this big furnace that's burning, and this scary guy, and the wizard, right, who sort of represents all the forces of the industrial world and all the forces of the monopolists and all these things. And I'm not going to show you the clip, but if you go on YouTube and you look up, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, at the end, of course, the curtain is drawn away, and all you have, all that the Wizard of Oz really is a man behind a curtain manipulating things. And this is the classic conspiracy theory, right? That McKinley, who was the president at the time, was really a kind of a weak guy who didn't really have a lot of power, and that all that the farmers really needed to realize is that, this is all a big conspiracy, that the whole idea that the government is controlling things, and that if you pull away the curtain and you reveal the truth, right, there's nothing to be afraid of. And of course that allows her and everybody else to get back to her home in Kansas. So that the moral of the story is pull the curtain away from the government, and you're going to get a better understanding what's going on. So for those of you who are interested, I told you that I would tell you the story of the little people in The Wizard of Oz. So it's interesting. This is a background story. This film was made in the 30s, and when they hired all of the Munchkins, who were the little people in that first scene in Oz, they had to find, 50, 60 different little people, and there weren't that many of them. They were hard to get together. But what had happened was a lot of these when they were younger, the little people that were working on the set of The Wizard of Oz were recruited by a talent scout who knew that in Coney Island, which was an amusement park outside of New York, they worked in a place called the Bavarian Village. They worked actually, this was actually a show. It was a place that you went to, and it was the Bavarian Village was basically a lot of little people who were dressed up in Bavarian lederhosen that were going around like singing German songs to the visitors to the amusement park, and it was this very well attended show. I think it was called the Bavarian Village or something like that. So what happened was they basically did some research. They looked up these people through Coney Island who had their names and their addresses on record, and they basically brought them all together again. And so these people who had dispersed after they had been together, living together in Coney Island, were all over the country, and they hadn't seen each other in years. So these are literally people that grew up together sort of through their adolescent years into their early 20s, and then left, and now they were kind of middle age. Most of them are, if you think about the timing of it, it's about 20 years later. So, in their 30s, late 30s perhaps. And so what happened was the first day that they filmed The Wizard of Oz, the scene with the Lollipop Guild and all of the little people standing around, they couldn't figure out where they were. They disappeared. And they were everyone's like, well, where is everybody? And it turned out that a lot of these people, right, had formerly been lovers. They were particularly back when they were adolescents. These were sort of their first boyfriends and first girlfriends. And obviously you don't have a lot of choices for partner when you're a little person. So they got back together, and they really got back together. I mean, they were having a good time. And so literally, if you look this up online, you'll see I'm not joking. It wasn't orgies, as was later reported by Judy Garland, said they were getting hammered and having orgies, which is, it's only partly true. They were drinking together and enjoying each other's company, and then they were pairing up and happy to see each other again. So next time you see The Wizard of Oz, you see that scene, you'll see a lot of very happy little people, and perhaps the combination of the alcohol and a little bit of sex really got them going. So that's the story of the little people and The Wizard of Oz. That has nothing to do with the populist movement, has nothing to do with the significance of The Wizard of Oz, but it's an interesting story, and it does tell you something about the culture of people who feel excluded from the mainstream of American culture. And obviously when they get together, they can do things on their own terms. So that's that. So if you still have time, what I want you to do is go into the assignment on Google Classroom, and in the classroom comments section, comment a little bit on where you see the urban-rural split playing out today, or anything that I just commented on in this video, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.